Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
A stark warning today from a major new report on climate change, which calls for an unprecedented plan to cap global warming. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says at the current rate, the world will pass the dangerous mark of 1.5 degrees within just 12 years. And the UK's Energy Minister, Claire Perry, says there's now no excuse, and the report should act as a rallying cry for governments around the world to avert catastrophic climate change. Sky's Lorna Shaddock reports.
It's been a year of weather extremes, from wildfires in California to flooding in China. Closer to home, we shivered through the beast from the east, then sweated through a summer heatwave. Now the UN says it's only going to get worse, unless we manage to limit global temperature rises to below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is not impossible, but will require unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society. There are clear benefits to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 2 degrees or higher.
These are just one thing we'd lose if average temperatures go above 1.5 degrees, says the report. But there are many more consequences. Mountains would lose their glaciers and rivers vanish, leaving the Indian subcontinent fighting for survival. A single-degree temperature increase could get rid of fresh water for a third of the planet within 85 years. Mountainous regions are at greater risk of landslides as the permafrost, which held them together for thousands of years, melts away. And low-lying countries like the Maldives would get submerged as sea levels rise. Countries already hit by hurricanes, meanwhile, face ever greater storms. Some of this is already happening. But if we almost halve emissions in the next 12 years and use much more renewable energy, the UN says we can still just about change course.
The message is over to governments at this stage. We've told you the scientific facts, the evidence, the costs. It is up to the governments now to decide what to do with it.
Back in 2015, governments did come together in Paris to act, agreeing to limit temperature rises to well below 2 degrees. But since then, one of the world's biggest polluters has changed tack.
It is time to exit the Paris Accord.
That makes the report's targets even more ambitious. But it also warns there's no time left for debate. This is the moment to decide, or the planet will decide for us. Lorna Shaddock, Sky News.
Would you eat less meat to save the planet? Will, would you be prepared to give up meat to save the planet?
I have been trying to give up meat, actually, but I gave up smoking early in the year, and that kind of trounced giving up meat. I was off meat when I gave up smoking, and I went back on meat to cope with giving up fags. But I'm going to go back off meat as soon as I've clear of the nicotine, which I'm nearly clear of.
Oh, so. Right, so you are putting yourself through all sorts of hurdles.
Yes, I'm very convinced by the arguments on global warming in relation to meat production. I think that was the real tipping point for me over vegetarianism. Obviously, there have been ethical concerns over the years, and it's just genuine. But it just looks disgusting now. Aesthetically, it looks disgusting.
Does it? Is that how you feel? Does it look disgusting to eat meat?
Oh, I mean, I had a steak last night. It looked all right, I'll be honest. But when you say, would you eat meat, stop eating meat to save the planet, I think if there was some sort of like James Bond-style countdown clock, then I might. But it is, I think it's a problem.
That's the report that was issued this morning.
Yeah, no, that might be that countdown clock. But I think maybe like for the every person, it still seems abstract. But like you say, this report might be that tipping point.
What individual responsibility do you take in terms of helping the environment?
I tried giving up meat, and then it was my mum's lamb biryani that got me again. But I'm going to try again. I think that sometimes we overemphasise personal responsibility, like single-use plastic, straws, so on and so forth, whereas actually, in order to stem global temperature change at 1.5, you need to start thinking about banning private cars from cities. You need to start thinking about fully transitioning to renewables within 10 years. It's not going to be solved by having, you know, a nice jute tote bag and having more tofu.
I mean, do you agree with that, Chris, that actually it's governments that were going to really change the dial on this?
Yeah, you've got to have sort of leadership from somewhere, and the UK, we've seen carbon dioxide emissions come down by 22% since 2010, and obviously when we're looking at coal, for instance, I mean, today, if you looked at statistics, 34% of our electricity use is coming from renewables and only 3.8% from coal. That's a huge change, and I think, we're going to prioritise things internationally. Trying to stop the use of coal, I think, should be one of our priorities. And obviously in the UK, we're one of the 8 countries that submitted a long-term plan to the UN, and I think, we've got a great soft power possibility here of leading on the environment.
Right, is that enough progress for you?
Well, it just seems a bit bizarre to focus on coal when we know that fracking is going to start up again in Lancashire, for instance. This isn't clean energy and it's not cost-free. I was reading some work by George Monbiot today, which was saying that in order to deal with climate change, we have to drastically rethink how we structure an economy. We can't say that economic growth doesn't have a cost when we know that it does, and it's a tremendous ecological one.
Right, and before we go on to the costs of taking action and not taking action, let's continue on our theme of personal responsibility and have a look at this historic video of Michael Gove from 1992 when he was a journalist.
The Earth Summit has been billed as the last chance to save the world. But for many celebrities, going green is the last chance to save their career. I've been rooting through the domestic detritus of Sting and a number of other green celebrities to see if their conversion is sincere or if they're just fair weather friends of the Earth. I took the rubbish to the real Friends of the Earth, where recycling expert Penny Walker assessed how green each load was. Throughout our test, she didn't know who our celebrities were or where the rubbish came from.
Fair game. Jeff, would you be prepared to go rooting through people's bins to see if they really are as green as they say?
I'll get onto that. How Scottish was he then? What has happened? He sounded a bit like groundskeeper Willie at that point from The Simpsons. I didn't know he was that Scottish. I think...
Yeah, he is very Scottish.
More Scottish then, though.
Aberdonian.
I guess he's lost it over time.
Inevitably, the accent has moderated over his years in Westminster, a kind of morphic resonance.
And fascinating though this is about the relative accents from Scotland.
Yeah, I think what we really need to do is get David Attenborough all around the world, because I think that, one series of Blue Planet 2 and Gove was practically joining Greenpeace. The problem is when you get these big consuming economies like the US and China, we're all standing there, washing out our peanut butter pots. We are acutely aware that if those economies even incrementally move up their use of fossil fuels, it does kind of remove any benefits that we might have created ourselves.
I mean, do you agree with that? Or do you think it's right for people like Michael Gove, having gone through the bins, to really test if people are doing what they say?
It's not going to happen. It's the sad fact of the matter. You're absolutely right. And the interesting thing, it seems to me, with this new report this morning is that it underpins the impotence of our own politics at a different level. When you look at climate change, and exactly the point you just made, which is, what's the point? Our neighbour will beggar us anyway. You sort of think, well, that also applies to political issues like Brexit, the way it's sucking everything out of the room. We can't even discuss real issues within the economy or real rights issues that we're concerned about. And you think, well, underlying it all is this problem of climate change, because it undermines the efficacy of our politics.
Well, let's find out a little bit more that's been in the report, the IPCC report, and talk to our correspondent Matt McGrath, who's in South Korea. Matt, can you just broadly outline for us the warnings and some of the questions that are raised in that report?
Sure, yes. The report was commissioned 3 years ago, just after the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, which said the world should aim to limit temperature rises this century to 2 degrees or try to keep them down to 1.5 as well. There wasn't a great deal of science about 1.5 degrees, so the UN commissioned this report, and basically they presented today after three years of research. And the conclusions that come out of that are pretty stark. It says that if the world wants to keep temperatures to 1.5, it's going to require a massive investment. It's going to require big changes for all of us in our lifestyle. And it's going to require all the things that you've been mentioning there, such as cutting emissions by half in the next 12 years, going to renewables completely by 2050, wiping out coal as a power source by the middle of the century, and the employment of a whole range of technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So there's no one simple fix here. The scientists say it's going to require everything, but they say the benefits are massive. If we keep temperatures to 1.5 as opposed to 2 degrees, it's going to be an incredibly much more livable planet than it will be if we allow temperatures to go to 2.
Can you give us some of the examples of what would improve if the world and global emissions were cut, or the temperatures were cut to 1.5 degrees centigrade as opposed to 2?
Yeah, the report goes to great lengths to talk about these type of things. So they talk about things like coral reefs. They say that at 2 degrees we're going to lose all of them in the world, 100% of them pretty much. If we keep temperatures to 1.5, we'll keep about 20% of them. Not great, but better than nothing. Similarly with flooding, sea level rise, they talk about a 10 centimetre difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. You mightn't think that's very much, but it's enough to keep 10 million people from being exposed to the dangers of rising seas. And it goes on and on. It talks about food, the impacts on crops, the impacts on fishing, the impacts across the board, where staying to 1.5 means a planet that's livable for humans and plants and species. A planet at 2 degrees is a lot more tricky for everyone. We lose a lot of those species and a lot more people are put in peril.
Matt McGrath in South Korea, thank you very much. Is that worth fighting for?
I think it is worth fighting for. 2 degrees means that huge swaths of the planet are going to be uninhabitable. And we're already seeing the effects of it now. So my heritage is from Bangladesh, so I was just having a look at what some of the effects of climate change are. We normally understand it simply in terms of rising sea levels. One of the effects actually has been increased amounts of arsenic-related poisoning in cities in Bangladesh because of salinity intrusion means you've got less and less safe sources of water. So one study put the rate of deaths from these arsenic-related poisonings at something like 12% of all deaths in Dhaka.
But why should people here, and why should people here take sort of personal responsibility and action in order to mitigate what's going on in Bangladesh when third world countries themselves aren't doing it?
Because Britain does have a historic responsibility. We are the largest single per capita contributor to global temperature changes since the Industrial Revolution. We started this, which means that we've got to be part of the solution to it.
Chris?
I would agree. I mean, in terms of looking forward for the UK's roles and responsibilities, it's incredibly important that we take action and we can try and sort of bring other countries together to realise the sort of the nature, the scale of the problem here. I mean, at home, also making the case that we've got the Gulf Stream that sort of historically sort of warms our own climate is now diverting, and we've got sort of a whole sequence now, alphabetical list of storms that we never used to have. Our climate is visibly changing, and we need to make sure that we make the case at home and abroad. I mean, Claire Perry set up something, the Powering Past Coal Alliance. So we've talked about how do we bring in the big guns like America now. Trump's now deciding to pull out of international agreements, but we can still work at a federal level with California, Washington, other big economies in the US.
Right, but the IPCC report itself says taking action will also be very costly financially, around 2.5% of global GDP every year for 2 decades. I mean, are governments really going to do that?
No, you'd need a world government. You can't impose anything like this unless you can send inspection teams piling into Chinese power stations, empowered to turn off, fossil fuel burning. You need this enormous kind of.
We had in the 80s.
Look at the myth of Britain in the war, and the idea of the kind of command economy and the kind of top-down politics we required to deal with a threat like that. We're dealing with a massive external threat. You would need world coordination.
We've seen it in the past where there has been a level of coordination where you've seen a real crisis emerging, say for instance with CFC gas and the evaporation of the ozone layer.
Yeah, but comparatively minor compared.
But it did prove that action was able to take, and it was almost like a complete eradication and an improvement in the level of ozone.
The technology was also there to transfer to automatically. There wasn't a problem.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting because we're going to be going through the sort of AI revolution, and there are opportunities to be looking at sort of new technologies for the future, how we can.
The Stern report came out years ago. The Stern report came out before the financial crash of 2007, 2008.
So 10 years has elapsed.
Do you remember, everybody, in the years leading up to 2007-8, sustainability was the buzzword. You virtually got up in the morning and said, "Can I have a sustainable bath? Is this a sustainable bit of toast?" Yeah. Good morning, Mr. Sustainable, how are you? Come 2000, 2008, disappeared.
Well, the crash, of course, happened, and what did that do?
Well, poverty comes through the door and principles go out the window. I think that maybe you need something, and this might be just a bizarre idea, but like when you get the thermostat or that disc that used to go round in your house where you can literally see what you're doing. And like, you know, my old man would see that going around quicker and he would freak out. So perhaps for a new generation, you need something that literally tells you what your carbon footprint is as you're doing it.
Do you think it would make a difference?
Well, I think what we're all talking about is, and maybe there's a problem as well in terms of like Project Fear has been broadly discredited. Maybe some people see this as part of that and something that they can actually sideline. But if you bring it into people's line of vision, it might be more effective.
Well, let's find out what the public's reaction is in terms of taking action to combat emissions. Ben Page is from Ipsos Mori. Ben, bring us up to date with the polling that's been done on this.
Well, we look at this around the world all the time. Overall in Britain, only 1 person in 10 will spontaneously say climate change is a huge problem facing this country, and that figure is, you know, hasn't really shifted much for a very long time. It's well behind things like Brexit, the NHS, you know, poverty and inequality, you name it. And I think one of the problems is that the public doesn't agree with the scientists. So nearly all scientists who are experts in this matter agree that climate change is caused by human activity. The public are much more mixed. Only about 4 in 10 will agree with that idea, and a lot more will say it's partly us, but it's also just the planet going through some changes. So the public isn't convinced on the science. The media might have a small part to play in that. And ultimately, I think the public is willing for the government to do things, but the government is very nervous.
Are you nervous, Chris?
No, I think we've got to be bold and we've got to be taking action, which is why, you know, we've talked about Michael Gove going through the bins. I mean, it goes to show he always had a zeal and a passion.
Well, that was 1992, but I mean, if we look at what
everyone thought he was a late convert to this stuff, and he clearly recognises he's now in a role.
Been standing on top of a big rubbish pile, literally.
No, he's set out the 25 environment plan. He has set out, you know, eradicating plastics from.
So when he winding down
issues for. Well, when he looked at issues around fracking, that's a better source of energy than coal, for instance. And you know, there's the Labour Party campaigning for the reopening of coal fields. I don't think we should be going down that route.
The Labour Party will ban fracking.
Fracking is a cleaner source of energy than coal field generation.
It's got tremendously bad ecological effects on the local area as well. That's why there's been huge protests in Balkan.
But is it better from a green point of view than coal?
But when we've got solar power getting cheaper and cheaper, wind power getting cheaper and cheaper, we do have these alternative sources which don't have such a huge detrimental effect on the local area.
You know, the best climate change dividend that we've had, really, is from the financial collapse of 2007-8. It's estimated that that had a very beneficial impact on global warming overall. And the sad fact of the matter is the kind of economic growth and the way we pursue economic growth in evolved industrial and post-industrial economies is absolutely inimical to resisting climate change.
Right.
The sad fact of the matter is we really have to embrace a lifestyle of knitting our own underwear out of yoghurt if we're going to make it through. And the idea that you can sort of get a new high-def flat-screen telly and then chuck it out on the pavement.
Well, this is what Gove was saying, wasn't he, standing on the rubbish thing was about recycling old things and not having such a disposable culture.
Do you need to compel people to be greener?
No, I think providing a range of options, which includes, you know, taking the flat screen TVs and being able to strip them out and take out the metals and recycling those things, you know, it doesn't mean just junking this stuff, and actually looking at how we can ensure at a local level, local authority level, that, you know, I personally do believe in individual responsibility. I do believe, you know, that all that stuff is, you know, welcome news that we can actually recycle this thing, and we've all got our own individual role to play in renewables when it comes to actually recycling waste that we make.
The world's top climate scientists say dramatic changes need to be made quickly to our lifestyles to avoid catastrophic climate change in the future. They say we should give up meat, throw less away, drive electric cars, walk more, fly less. And governments must make major policy changes now to reduce the impact of rising global temperatures. Just 1.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century will mean rapid and unprecedented changes to all aspects of society. 2 degrees warmer will mean millions of people losing their homes because of flooding as sea levels rise. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says the world is currently on track for much worse, a rise of 3 degrees rather than 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. Our science editor David Shukman is in South Korea, where the report was revealed.
The warming of the Earth is heading for levels that modern humans have never experienced. That's the unnerving implication of this latest report. It says the rise of the oceans could accelerate, even with what sounds like a small increase in temperature. Heat waves are set to become more intense sooner than expected. And forest fires, combined with more warming, will have a profound impact on wildlife.
The report clearly shows
When the report was unveiled at a press conference here in South Korea, it came with a startling conclusion.
If action is not taken, it will take the planet into an unprecedented climate future if we compare it to what has happened during all of human evolutionary history.
The report says massive cuts are needed in the gases warming the atmosphere. That means turning away from fossil fuels like oil, because when they're burned, they give off carbon dioxide. Vast new forests must also be planted to soak up the gas, to have any chance of keeping global warming to a safe level.
The report has sent a very clear message that if we don't act now and have substantial reductions in carbon dioxide emissions over the next decade, we are really making it very challenging to impossible to keep warming below 1.5 degrees.
The report spells out that greenhouse gases must fall by 45% by 2030, just over a decade away. It says that up until 2035, it'll cost 2.5% of global GDP. That's the total value of goods and services around the world. Not cheap, but the scientists say it will help. And renewable energy, they say, must produce 85% of our electricity by 2050. The obvious question that arises from the radical suggestions in this report is any of this remotely feasible? So many countries depend on coal, the dirtiest of the fossil fuels, and have plans to use more of it. And the vast majority of vehicles on the roads use petrol and diesel. On the other hand, there are some significant developments underway. The cost of renewable energy, like solar and wind, is falling, making it much more viable. And electric cars are set to become more mainstream as the major car manufacturers invest in them. But however this plays out, making a change on this scale is going to be a huge challenge. The key decisions on this now pass to the countries that are the biggest polluters, like China and the United States. But the report also says that people going about their everyday lives have a say as well.
We can all make choices about the energy we choose to consume. So we can make a move through our choices of energy consumption to renewable energy to provide the market for renewable energy. In terms of land, a lot of the land we use produces food. So we can make choices, dietary choices, about what we choose to eat.
Around the conference centre, new skyscrapers and highways crawling with traffic. All this relies on fossil fuels, and like many developments around the world, it'll be incredibly hard to change. The scientists here have mapped out a way of minimising global warming. We'll now see what everyone makes of it. David Shukman, BBC News in South Korea.
So what can individuals do to help fight climate change? Our science correspondent Victoria Gill has been looking at the small changes that could make a big difference.
As alarming as the message about climate change is, modern life keeps moving. So in the midst of an issue that's truly global, how can any one of us make choices to help the now urgent fight against climate change? One way, scientists point out, is to think more about how much carbon dioxide, the most prevalent greenhouse gas in our atmosphere, is emitted by the production of the food we eat. And that's something these shoppers are adding to their list of concerns.
I think it's really important to try and reduce the amount of air miles and that sort of thing that our food is travelling, because it's not really doing anyone any good, is it, by, using unnecessary fuel just to buy food.
We check the label, and so often the film isn't recyclable, so that's something that is a concern and I think could be massively improved.
I think the meat's completely cut down, totally. I bought chicken for my husband here, but meat's complete red meat's a no-no.
Oh, it's a total no-no. Cut that out completely.
Cut that out completely.
And why is that? Is that health, environment?
Health, basically.
But that health-conscious decision chimes exactly with the environmental impact of meat and dairy versus vegetables. While animal products provide just 18% of our calories, they take up more than 80% of global farmland, and their production emits significantly more greenhouse gas.
And then there's transport. While some people might be investing in an electric car, there are much cheaper decisions that every one of us can make every single day about how we move around.
According to the World Health Organization, one passenger making a journey of 1 kilometre by car emits an average of 129 grams of carbon. A passenger travelling 1 kilometre by bus is equivalent to just over 101 grams. 1 kilometre by bike emits no carbon at all. Where possible, scientists say we should use an electricity supply from renewable energy sources. And as some businesses race to become carbon neutral, that's become a priority.
We have a huge role to play in encouraging our suppliers to provide renewable green energy. However, we can also do that through on-site generation, through solar panels and wind turbines, and also through what we sell our customers, such as lower energy consuming goods and services.
What's now apparent is that the time we all have to make a positive difference is rapidly running out. Victoria Gill, BBC News.
Now, it's been described by the scientists who wrote it as a clarion bell, a report warning the world that unprecedented and immediate change is needed to prevent a climate catastrophe. A report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the United Nations says we need to act without delay to prevent the destruction of coral reefs and stop sea levels rising by as much as 10 centimetres. If that happened, large parts of the world could become uninhabitable. Siobhan Kennedy explains.
It's a simple fact. Cutting meat from your diet, even once a week, will help reduce global warming.
There is no doubt about it. What we are doing, how we are eating, is screwing the planet.
In fact, the impact is so profound that Paul Brown changed his company's entire business model to go vegan.
The stats are clear. It's better for our health and it's better for the planet. 18% of all global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, come as a consequence of animal agriculture. For context, only 13% comes from transportation. 45% of all the landmass on the Earth is currently being used for animal agriculture. Every second there's deforestation happening to the size of a football pitch to feed the livestock.
In part, it's these alarming statistics that have led scientists to conclude that only rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes to all aspects of our lives will be enough to limit the worst effects of climate change.
The scientists behind today's report agree that eating less meat is one of the individual actions we can take to help limit global warming. But it's a daunting task to roughly halve the amount of greenhouse gases globally within the next 12 years, or face, they say, disastrous and possibly irreversible climate change.
Many believe we've already started to see just that with this year's widespread fires and extreme flooding. But the warning is disastrous events like these could become commonplace. The world is now 1 degree hotter than pre-industrial temperatures. At the Paris Climate Change Conference in 2015, a plan was agreed to limit the rise in temperatures to 1.5 degrees. But today's report warns that the world is already on track to overshoot that target. And if nothing changes, will be 3 degrees hotter by the end of the century. At that point, the majority of the world's coral reefs will be wiped out. Arctic summer ice will be critically reduced, exposing the sea to hotter temperatures, while polar region ice sheets will continue to melt, drastically raising sea levels and forcing millions from their homes. And much of the Amazon, the world's largest forest and CO2 absorber, would die off from drought. That's the worst case scenario, yes, but we're already headed in that direction, which is why scientists say it's critical that global temperatures rise no more than 1.5 degrees above that pre-industrial average.
We are only actually shaving off the worst impacts of climate change if we manage to keep temperature to 1.5. So the onus is right now, I think, increasingly on governments.
Ms Figueres brokered the Paris climate deal, which set a tone of optimism. The problem is the government, or the man, Donald Trump, running one of the world's biggest polluting countries, America, says he'll pull out of the Paris Accord. And despite efforts, the levels of global greenhouse gases, from coal-fired power stations to polluting transport to deforestation, continue to rise. The same old conclusions then, that actions to curb the increases and stick to the limits must happen faster.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Minister for Energy, Claire Perry, via a phone link from Luxembourg, and I asked her whether governments were being honest with voters about how much it could cost to stop climate change.
I think we are being honest about that, and actually we of course, people talk about the policy costs that we've put in place so we could, for example, build the biggest offshore wind base in the world. We lead the world in offshore wind, and we have put those costs onto consumers' bills. But the good news is, because we're all living in much more energy efficient households, we're using LED light bulbs, energy bills are actually falling. So I think we are honest. In fact, the UK is very honest about what these policy costs are. What people tell me is they want to invest in the future. They understand the importance of, preserving this brilliant planet and passing it on in good shape. But I still have to make those decisions. Who pays and what's a fair way to allocate those costs?
So higher taxes to save the planet could be a slogan at the next election, could it?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily going to need higher taxes, because what's amazing is the pace of innovation we've seen is actually driving costs down.
You have said that you'll end sales of petrol and diesel cars by 2040, but the Committee on Climate Change said be braver, bring that forward. Is that possible after this report today?
Well, it's possible, but one of the big topics of debate tomorrow with our European partners will be just that. And of course, we are very much in the vanguard of that ambition. Other countries who, like us, have big car-making industries are less ambitious. So I think for me, the real challenge is taking that UK ambition and stiffening the resolve of our European partners.
If you had Donald Trump in front of you right now, what one fact or one sentence would you say to him to make him change his mind on withdrawing the US from Paris?
I would say that investing in low carbon delivers jobs.
Would he buy that?
Well, it's delivered over 400,000 jobs in the UK. And by the way, they're in places that have been left behind by the Industrial Revolution. So I'd say to him, you don't want to be promising people a job digging up the last few tons of coal ever burnt in the United States. You want to be investing in the technology leadership that the United States has shown in the future. I'd love the chance to put that argument to him.
I hope you get it. Claire Perry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is best to put this tonight in the stark and simple terms used by the scientists who produced today's devastating UN-backed report on global climate change. We have just 12 years to save the planet. Yes, you heard that right. 12 years to halt the seemingly inexorable slide towards global catastrophe. What needs to be done is to limit the rise in the world's temperature since the Industrial Revolution to just 1.5 degrees, not 2, as previously thought. It might not sound all that much, but if we can't do this, if we don't radically change our ways, both individually and socially, the scientists say the consequences do not bear thinking about.
We're all familiar with the images of a changing climate, and for a long time they've been seen as postcards from the future, dramatic events that will happen if we don't intervene. But today's landmark report tells a different story. Climate change is happening now, and we have to act now to keep warming below 1.5 degrees.
Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is not impossible, but will require unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society.
It used to be that 2 degrees of global warming was seen as a kind of safe limit, but today's report suggests it's way beyond our environmental comfort zone. In the Arctic, with 1.5 degrees warming, ice-free summers could come once every 100 years. But with 2 degrees of warming, it would be ice-free every decade. With 1.5 degrees, 10 million fewer people are affected by sea level rise. At 2 degrees, small Pacific islands and large parts of countries like Bangladesh are lost to the sea. And with 1.5 degrees, 70 to 90% of coral reefs are lost. But at 2, it's virtually all of them. Since the world signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016, we've passed 1 degree of global warming. We could hit 1.5 just 12 years from now. I asked the woman who brokered the Paris deal whether she thinks we can do it.
Is there any prospect the global economy can move fast enough?
Today's report certainly poses a challenge to all of us, but from what I can see that the real economy is doing in most countries, I'm actually still confident that we have the technology, that we have the wherewithal, that we have the finance to be able to live up to this challenge.
But there's a mountain to climb. These are rising CO2 emissions, and this is the reduction needed to get to zero by mid-century. So how do we achieve this massive change? Renewable energy needs to supply up to 85% of electricity. Coal has to be left in the ground. Transport, infrastructure and industry will have to be radically cleaner. Millions of square kilometres of land must become forests to take carbon out of the atmosphere, and we probably need new ways of actively removing greenhouse gases from the air.
So it's technically possible to meet this 1.5 degree target in terms of the numbers, but whether it's feasible, it's a huge challenge. Everyone in the world has a right to a comfortable lifestyle, good quality of life, and all these things require energy, transport and so on. So these need to be taken into account in international development.
Given there's projected to be 2 billion more people on the planet by 2050, it's a daunting prospect. But the consequences of doing nothing are more daunting still.
And as I said at the top, Tom is here to discuss this. Tom, just given everything you just said there, I guess the thing I don't understand are why scientists are so optimistic that all this is going to be I mean, it sounds like an impossible task.
If you actually look at the numbers, what we've got to do in terms of reducing carbon emissions from where they are now to zero by the middle of the century, 2040, 2045, it's quite reasonable to say it can't be done, but walk away. I think the reason for the optimism is this. Without it, we're just not going to get there. And I think it's a little bit more deeper than just sort of hope, but bare hope. Because actually, if it looked in the right way, we can do this by persuading people there is opportunity here. That's what Cristiano Figueres' big message has been since the beginning. When you change the global economy away from a carbon fossil fuel-based one to something that's greener, there's money to be made. There are jobs to be created. There is opportunity there for everybody. And you can see this certainly in the UK, and we've managed to reduce our emissions by 43% here in the UK, largely just by switching to renewable energy. That's just one small sector. Forget housing and transport and all the other things that need to be done. Just by building offshore wind farms, it's jobs, it's opportunity. If you could have that same attitude globally, that actually presents a very concrete way we could get there. But it's absolutely true. It is a mind-bogglingly daunting task.
We like a bit of optimism, Tom. Thank you very much. We certainly do need it.
It is scary stuff, to be honest. According to the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have now probably reached 1 degree of global warming compared to pre-industrial times, which they take as 1850 to 1900. The land has warmed by more than the sea and will go on doing so. Average temperatures are thought to be rising 0.2 degrees a decade. Can we stop the overall rise at 1.5 degrees? It is geophysically possible, they say, but would require huge reductions in carbon fuel use between now and 2050. Unprecedented ones. Even if we limit the rise to 1.5 degrees, sea level rises by maybe half a metre, plus or minus a quarter of a metre. Is the world geared up to tackle this kind of global problem? We'll be looking at the politics and policy aspects soon. First, though, here is Chris Cook on what the scientists are saying.
Some of the official predictions made about climate change sound biblical in scale. More drought, more famine, more flooding, more of the most powerful tropical cyclones, and of course, the seas rising. A familiar litany, and one they say we need to do more to fight. Something that will need rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. Our current no-action path is like this, rising carbon emissions, and that would take us to a more than 4-degree rise by 2100. But there is policy in place that should restrain carbon growth onto this path. That probably means about a 3-degree rise, and if countries make good on some of their promises, it should be a touch lower than that. Scientists, though, have been hoping for this path, which would mean about a 2-degree rise. Now, though, they say we should aim for under 1.5 degrees. Now, that half-a-degree change may not sound like much, but scientists think it could radically reduce the harm done to our world by climate change. The thing is, though, to get there, we have to reduce our net carbon emissions to 0 by the year 2050. And that means huge changes to the way that we live, to how we get around, to how we generate electricity, to how we arrange our cities, to what we wear, even to what we eat. You can see why zero emissions is so radical if you look at carbon emissions in historical context. hitting zero by 2050 would need a very sudden shift in direction.
It's about making the Chinese leadership, the Indian leadership, many of the African leaders decide to move away from coal. And unfortunately, that's quite expensive for these countries. And the real issue is whether and who is prepared to pay the substantive costs of a fast switch out of this most pernicious form of fossil fuels.
Now, individual countries make their own climate plans. Getting them to follow through, though, is hard. For one thing, getting to 1.5 degrees would mean investing 2.5% of the world economy every year from now until 2035 into energy infrastructure. According to Bloomberg, that's a 7-fold increase. 2.5% of our economy would be about £50 billion, more than we spend on defence.
We cannot hold to the current standard of living and really radically decarbonise. This has cost to us. We are, to be blunt, living beyond our means, and no politician wants to tell us that.
The fact of climate change is no longer in dispute. How we respond to it, however, is a political challenge that will only become more acute in the coming decades. And the price tag is rising.
Chris Cook reporting. So, is it possible to get the planet to align around the latest science? In a moment, we'll talk to Simon Beard, who studies existential risk at Cambridge University, and to Baroness Worthington, who's drafted the UK's Climate Change Act 10 years ago. But are the chances of a global response weakened when the leader of the world's second largest polluter is sceptical? In the US, polls show that Americans' views on climate change are increasingly polarised. Republicans and independent voters are increasingly likely to think the seriousness of global warming is exaggerated, whereas Democrats are more worried about it than before. So let's try to peek into the mindset of the administration there. I'm joined now from Washington by Myron Ebell, who was Donald Trump's environmental advisor during the presidential transition period before the inauguration. He's director of the CIA think tank that campaigns on behalf of the US energy industry, and deemed the Paris Climate Agreement an unprecedented power grab on America's consumers and economy. Very good evening to you, Mr. Ebell. Do you think this report, this latest one, will change the administration's view on climate change at all?
No, I don't. I think the United States is divided, as you said. I think some states like California and New York and some of the New England states are pursuing the European Union plan to make energy more expensive. But I think President Trump and the heartland states that elected him are on a very different, very pro-energy path.
Yeah. I mean, is the problem here that effectively belief in the United States has just gone completely political? That it's almost identity politics. To show you're a proper hard Republican, you just adhere to the view that climate change is a global plot, that the UN is trying to take over the US. Is that what's really going on here?
From my perspective, it's become identity politics for the left to claim that there's an imminent crisis. The problem with this report is it foreshortens the problem. The rate of warming, according to the data, is much slower than the models used by the IPCC. They also don't consider the fact that we've already had 1 degree of warming.
Let me interrupt you because
they estimate.
Let me interrupt because I think what you're trying to do is to sort of show that you know more about the science than the scientists, which is sort of not the case because they're the scientists. What you have to do is show not that you're cleverer than the scientists, and there were a lot of them involved in this, but that the scientists have somehow been taken over by a plot or have been infected by corruption or payments or politics. Now, have you any evidence that the science... I don't want to hear your argument that the science is wrong because you don't know anything about it, but have you any evidence that the science has been corrupted in some way?
The United Nations, when it created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, charged it with supporting the climate agenda of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's meant to be a promotional body. It's not meant to be an objective scientific advisor. That if you go back and look from day one, it has been a promoter, not a neutral scientific body.
Let me pick you up on that. So do you think the scientists who've reviewed these 6,000 papers to produce this latest publication, 86 lead writers, Do you literally think they don't believe what they have said? Is that your contention?
They're climate campaigners first at the highest level rather than objective
But you're a climate
scientists.
campaigner more than they are. They're not even paid, these guys. You're paid. I mean, they're not paid. It's absolutely... Go on.
Look, we've had, the study says that we've had about 1 degree of warming already. They don't consider the tremendous benefits that have flowed to humanity, the flourishing.
Again, you're trying to show you know more about the science than the scientists, and you don't. So I come back to, do you, because I'm fascinated in this sort of personally, as to denial as a sort of human phenomenon. Do you ever think there may be a small chance that the scientists have simply done the work, straightforwardly looked at their results, published their results in an open-minded and unbiased way, and presented their conclusions? Because really, you're just saying either you know more, or that they are somehow lying to us about what they really have found or what they believe.
I've investigated the claims, and I find them wanting from multiple viewpoints. One of them is that what they are proposing needs to be done will have much more deleterious effects on the planet and on humanity than the problem that they have identified. I have also tried to show you that the problem is in slow motion compared to what they're claiming it is, and I believe that they're claiming it's an imminent crisis because that's their charge from the United Nations at the highest level.
But I mean, okay, so you're saying they've been instructed to say what they say. Can you imagine anything that the scientists could say that would persuade the administration that it needs to take this more seriously?
No, I can't. I think that the administration and the American people are pretty convinced that a pro-energy agenda is much more viable and will have much better results than an energy rationing agenda.
Myron Ebel, thanks very much for joining us. Thank you very much. Well, as I say, joining us here in the studio, Baroness Bryony Worthington, lead author on the UK's 2008 Climate Change Act, and Simon Beard from the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University. Good evening to you both. Simon Beard, do you think human beings are capable of dealing with a problem like this?
Yes, we are. And the good news is climate change is anthropogenic. Human activity is causing it. And that means we have the capability to stop it. You know, this isn't sunspots, this isn't some global conspiracy, this is something that we're doing and we can undo. You know, we have a bright future ahead of us, and we have the capability to bring that about. And it would be an incredibly good deal to do that.
So you'd much rather we were causing it than it was something else, because that means we have agency in this and we can do something about it.
When you study human extinction, the thing you really look for is an extinction that people are causing and that they know what they're doing. Right? The things that we worry about are the things that, like with technological development, where there's a risk but we don't really understand it, or where something might happen and you have no control over it, space weather, asteroids, and so on. Those are much scarier. Climate change is just a question of what do you think is going to be the best investment for the future? And, you know, it's becoming increasingly apparent that actually climate mitigation is going to achieve a great deal for us and our children.
OK. Baroness Worthington, I'm sure you disagree with everything you heard from Myra Ebel there. I'm just guessing, correct?
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
right. So we can sit blaming the Americans for being sort of deniers. However, is it not the case that political realism in Europe as well is an obstacle to all of this? Because actually the US may well meet its Paris climate change commitments, despite the Myra Ebels.
Yeah,
and there may be European countries that don't.
Well, Europe as a whole will, I'm pretty certain, because we're already overshooting our targets. And in fact, we could go further in Europe. But that's largely because we've got some quite sensible policies. We've introduced prices on pollution, because at the moment we're just emitting all of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for free. And we know it's causing a problem. And, you know, Myron likes to point to the European Union as being anti-energy or some such statement. Nothing could be further from the truth. We're unlocking new sources of energy and we're buying down the costs of that energy so that other countries can use it.
But it is interesting, isn't it? There aren't politicians who are going to say... I mean, there are politicians who are struggling to find 3 billion, 4 billion for social care, let alone 50 billion to spend into energy so we can have the same energy we have now except cleaner.
But the accept cleaner is quite important because there are co-benefits to us doing this. So cleaner air in cities is going to reduce the National Health Service bill because we'll have fewer people suffering from all the related health impacts of the diesel fumes that are currently choking our cities. So there are lots of cost saving.
You ask a government, hey, let's put up petrol tax. How many years is it now in a row that we've frozen petrol tax rather than put up fuel duty?
Well, there's a big controversy about the fuel duty price, but actually, if you look at other policies that we've seen in the power sector, just putting a price on alone isn't actually the important thing. The important thing is to recycle funds and to provide deployment support for new technologies. So the new wave of electric vehicles that are coming, they've been really pushed forward by policy, and policy in China, most interestingly. So, you know, Europe's got a way to catch up on transport, but I'm sure we will do so.
Simon, isn't the problem here... Basically, there are huge time lags in everything we do, so there's always a kind of let's do it tomorrow rather than today, and the effects are not always felt by the same people who have to take the mitigating actions. So my actions don't come back and thwack me in the face, do they? I mean, my actions are affecting other people. Those are precisely the problems which lead to sort of selfish behaviour around there and stop human beings solving things.
Absolutely, and if we'd been doing this when we first discovered how catastrophic climate change could be, actually in the 1960s, in the 1970s, we'd be having to do an awful lot less. It would be a lot easier. But at the end of the day, it's still a really good deal. It's still going to benefit many people who are currently living. It's not just the very young. It's not just our children or our grandchildren. All sorts of people are going to be benefited by not having to go through the terrible risks, the terrible catastrophes that climate change could be. And, climate change has been a big controversy for a long time. When I was young, I'm a millennial, when I was young, it was about if, then it was about when. Actually, in the last year, it's about how. And that's what this report is about, and that's what gives me hope.
But there are three tragedies of climate change. The first is the tragedy of the commons, which is what you're describing. We've all got to act together. And that will have to be solved by multilateralism. We'll have to reinvent that. And then the IPCC is leading the way. But there is another important tragedy, which is the tragedy of the incumbents. And what Myron represents is that representing of the powers that are benefiting from the status quo. And what we've got to do collectively as citizens is say, you know what, actually, the time of fossil fuel energy is coming to an end if it's not dealing with its pollution. There are many other ways of doing this, and the human brain is very good at solving these challenges. We've got capital waiting to be put into projects. We just need to now work out how to get that money flowing into the solutions, and the costs are coming down.
Plenty of societies, quite civilised societies, have collapsed, haven't they, Myron? I mean, you can read Jared Diamond's book called Collapse about sort of civilisations that have...
And either they weren't collapsing from something anthropogenic or they weren't collapsing from something they understood. There aren't examples of people who have known the risks, they've known the challenges, they've known how to solve the problem, and they've just walked into the dark.
But there are people who deny the problem, right? And that there will always be, right?
There will always be people who deny the problem. There are people who think the Earth is flat.
Yeah.
We have to get over them.
Exactly, and they're in the minority. When I started on this 20 years ago, it was just a small group of NGOs sounding the alarm with a few scientists. Now all the scientists are freaked out, and the message is coming across loud and clear. Your article today is just an example of that. We've got the lead story, and that's where it should stay until we really make progress.
Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.